Hello and welcome. I'm your host, Peter Gaiman, Professor of Old Testament and Biblical Languages at Shepherd Seminary. This podcast is dedicated to discussing issues related to Scripture and theology. For more information, visit petergaiman.com.
Well, a happy 4th of July weekend to everybody out there, unless, of course, you are not listening to this on the 4th of July weekend, which you probably won't be. But in any case, I still wish you a happy 4th of July retroactively, and I hope it was all that you desired in life. But today we're going to talk about something totally unrelated to 4th of July. We're going to talk about the date of Revelation and when it was written, and why that matters. So the reason I want to talk about this is because I've been talking about preterism a little bit, and there's been some issues that I've been trying to point out with it. And again, I'm going to put my motivation completely on the table. I have multiple friends, and they have been listening to Jeff Durbin, Doug Wilson, a bunch of preterists, and I really, really like those guys, appreciate them, think that they are doing a great service for the Lord in many ways. But I also think that there's a danger to following in certain eschatological footsteps. And I think you can disagree with somebody on one hand, but then at the same time, really appreciate what they do. And so I want to raise some issues with the preterism system in order to facilitate better interpretation, because I think we ought to be concerned about how to interpret the Bible. And end times study, eschatology, isn't just some, let's just ignore it, whatever, it doesn't matter. It does matter, and it's also important that we treat God's word, all of it, with the appropriate mindset and the appropriate hermeneutic. The way we interpret it is important to our Christian living. And so one of the things about preterism in particular is that they take a minority view on the book of Revelation. In fact, it wouldn't be incorrect to say that their view depends on when you date the book of Revelation. Now, all the other views, amillennialism, futurism, whether it be idealism in some form, those views it doesn't really matter when the book is written necessarily. But for preterism, you need to have the book of Revelation written before the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. So just by way of reminder, I want to throw out there that preterism would say that the book of Revelation is dated during Nero's reign, specifically somewhere between AD 64 and 68. In fact, Kenneth Gentry, who's a very well-known preterist, I've mentioned him just briefly before, he says specifically that you have to have the death of Nero being prophesied in Revelation, the Jewish war in AD 67 being prophesied, and then obviously the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. And all of that needs to encapsulate the persecution that comes from Nero in AD 64. And so basically, according to this timeline set up by Gentry and many other preterists, you have a time frame between 64 and 67 AD when the book of Revelation needs to be written, because you need that 42-month window as well that's brought in there, although some people might debate what that's about. But most people would, from a preterist understanding, would take the 42-month tribulation as being a real tribulation as part of that prophecy. And so it would have to be at least 42 months prior to 70 AD, which would give us spring of AD 67 at least. And then before that would be possible as well, but it's got to take place during somewhere between 64 and 67 to most preterists. Now, the other main view, now there are a couple other outlier views, but we won't talk about them. The other main view would be the 95 to 96 AD date under the reign of Domitian. And this has historically been the date that has been held by the church. We'll talk about that in a little bit. But it's been challenged in recent years, challenged quite a bit, I would say, by individuals like DeMar and Gentry, and then Doug Wilson in most recent time, just coming out with a book this last year. And so and I haven't read it yet, so I hope to get to it one day soon. And when you think about how all these things are portrayed, then it becomes a very central issue. And I'm not just saying I'm not saying that I think it's just a central issue. Preterists themselves talk about how preterism rises or falls on the dating of Revelation. So, for example, in a review of a fellow preterist's Revelation commentary called The Days of Vengeance, Gentry commented and said, quote, if it could be demonstrated that Revelation were written 25 years after the fall of Jerusalem, then Kilton's entire labor, Kilton is the author of the commentary, Kilton's entire labor would go up in smoke. End quote. In another comment, Gentry says in his own work, Before Jerusalem, he says, quote, whether Revelation was written early or not has a tremendous bearing upon the direction interpreters may take in its exposition. If the book was written 2.5 decades after the destruction of the temple, however, then the prophecies are necessarily open to an extrapolation into the most distant future, and to the exclusion of the important events of AD 67 to 70. Hence, the whole bearing of Revelation on New Testament eschatology may well be altered by the determination of the matter before us. End quote. So I think those quotes get the point across, and they're not alone. R.C. Sproul has some quotes like that. This is a very important issue. And because it's been such an important issue in the last couple decades especially, there's an individual by the name of Mark Hitchcock, and in 2005 he graduated from Dallas Theological Seminary with his THD, and he wrote his dissertation, supervised by Honer and Constantine Campbell, I believe, and he wrote his dissertation on the dating of Revelation. And I have looked at it previously, and I thought I'd crack it out again and read through it a little bit. And I'm just really impressed with a lot of his research. And I'm going to bring up some of the points that he makes. I think he does a great job in laying out some of the evidence. And I think it's very helpful. So I'm going to kind of pit a lot of Hitchcock's work against Gentry and some of the other top name preterists. Won't talk so much about Durbin since he doesn't really have anything in print per se, but this is more of an academic side, dating, putting side by side and trying to compare the evidence. But I think it'll be very helpful with regard to that. Now, as a side note, I will say I was actually in a theological Facebook group recently in the last couple weeks, and I saw the date of Revelation come up, so my ears, well, my metaphorical ears, perked up a little bit, and I was reading some of the comments, and there were a couple preterists that were talking about it, and one of them flat out said, yeah, it's impossible to get away from the late date of Revelation, but I'm working on a new theory so that it can be some sort of retroactive fake prophecy, like looking back or something like that. And I was thinking to myself, okay, if your eschatological viewpoint forces you to try to come up with some wacko interpretation of Revelation, I use wacko in a theological sense, I'm just teasing, but if you're forced to come up with some sort of brand new interpretation of Revelation because as a retroactive prophecy or something like that, because you can't get around the late date, I think it's time to change the system, not necessarily change the way you interpret Scripture. And so we want to obviously keep the literal hermeneutic. That's one thing that I've always appreciated about preterists is they're trying to make Scripture fit with what actually happens. And I just think that there's some things that they miss along the way. And so we're talking about this with an attempt to be fair and work through it from an academic standpoint, and hopefully it'll be helpful. So the way that the dissertation is broken down by Hitchcock is that he talks about it from a church history standpoint and then from an internal standpoint. We don't have time to go through it all today. I just want to talk a little bit about some of the early church history of Revelation. Now, as Hitchcock points out, and his dissertation is well worth checking out, the essentially unanimous support of early church history is on a late date of Revelation, specifically during the date of Domitian, an emperor who reigns from 81 to 96 AD. So, and there's actually a direct quote which relates to that, which we'll talk about in a second. Now, the counterpoint that preterists bring up is that there's a unhealthy reliance upon one, maybe two sources early on. And so it's a domino effect. People kind of recapitulate a viewpoint because of a misunderstanding or an errant source that's found early on in Christianity. But I'll front load it a little bit here. I think that the bulk of the evidence is on the support of the 95-96 AD from an external standpoint. Any evidence that it can be used to marshal a earlier date for that is largely later. So we'll look at some of that perhaps in future episodes. But today I just want to talk about two main evidences that are brought forward in defense of a late date of Revelation, 95-96, external evidence. And that would be Hegesippus and Irenaeus. So everyone knows Irenaeus. We'll talk about him in just a second. But Hegesippus is a church father who lived from sometime around 120 AD to 190 AD. He's essentially contemporary with Irenaeus, but little is known about him. He apparently wrote a lot, and Eusebius is a major church historian who was alive during the 4th century, 300 to 340 AD, somewhere around there. And Eusebius was stationed at Caesarea, had a great library, and he talked extensively about the memoirs that he had from Hegesippus. So when you think about, it's something that my mentor, Dr. Varner, always used to say is the things that you would wish for in history. A lot of these works that we no longer have because they were destroyed, they were lost to history. You have a lot of Origen's work that was lost. His Hexapla was largely, there's a few fragmentary evidences left, but most of it was lost. All these great things that would just be so precious to have copies of. And this would be another one of them, is to have Hegesippus's writings. But what we do have is largely preserved by Eusebius. And Eusebius relies on him quite a bit, by the way. As you go through Eusebius's work on his ecclesiastical history, that's one of his most famous works. Eusebius is usually labeled the father of church history just because he does such a good job of recording all of these things. And he quotes Hegesippus probably, it kind of varies on who you read on this, but he quotes him at least 8 times, and he probably refers to him at least a handful of other times, not by name. And so he's definitely well aware of his work. He has it available to him. And so we understand that this was a valuable work for Eusebius in recording early church history. Now, as we look at some of the things that Eusebius records and relies on Hegesippus, there is a section in Book 3 of Ecclesiastical History, this is Eusebius's work, where he talks about the exile of John. So it says this in chapter 18, section 1 of Book 3. He says, "At this time, as the story goes, the apostle and evangelist John was still alive and was condemned to live in the island of Patmos for his witness to the divine word." So that's what Eusebius is writing about. And notice the phrase there, "as the story goes." That seems to be typical in Eusebius, or at least a marker in Eusebius, where he would be saying there's a written tradition on this. If not written, at least oral, but most likely written at this time because of how he uses that phrase elsewhere. And as you look at the surrounding context, we're in Book 3, Chapter 18 of this. Well, as we look at the surrounding context, there are references to Hegesippus around here. So when we look, for example, chapter 19, and by the way, the chapters, if it's similar, if you visualize it similarly as a scripture book, there's sometimes as little as 1 verse per chapter in some of these sections. So chapter 8 only has 5 verses. So we're talking about the 6th line, essentially the 6th verse after talking about the exile at Patmos. You have Eusebius recording that Hegesippus is relating these facts. So he talks about the persecution of Domitian and how Domitian had sought to destroy the descendants of David. And then he says at the end of that line right there in chapter 19, he says, Hegesippus relates these facts in the following words. And then in verse 20, or chapter 20, he relates some of the further information from Hegesippus. A couple lines down past that, he also says, these things are related by Hegesippus. So it seems to be very clear in context here of this passage, beginning in chapter 17, really, but then all the way through chapter 20 in this book 3 of ecclesiastical history, you have a reliance on Hegesippus. Now, there may be other individuals there who are related as well, but at least we see very clearly that Hegesippus is being mentioned as a source. Now, just 2 lines after talking about these things being related to Hegesippus, you see this statement. But after Domitian had reigned 15 years and Nerva had succeeded the empire, the Roman Senate, according to the writers that record the history of those days, voted that Domitian's honors should be canceled and that those who had been unjustly banished should return to their homes and have their property restored to them. So notice what he's saying here. This is Eusebius, and he's saying this record of Domitian having reigned 15 years, and then after he's gone, the Senate revokes these exiles, and this was recorded by those who write the history of those days. Well, in context, he's got to be talking about Hegesippus in regard to that. So when we think about, if we trace that back to the previous part of that section, when it says, verse 1 of chapter 18 there in ecclesiastical history, it says, it was said, or you could translate it as it was related, or it's been made known that in this persecution, the apostle and evangelist John, who was still alive, was condemned to dwell on the island of Patmos. Well, that persecution that's being talked about is very clearly, there's no other way to understand that, as being Domitian's persecution. So, if you think about, okay, well, who's relating the fact that John was in exile during the persecution by Domitian? Now, remember, we're dealing with 2 dates here, 2 possibilities. You have Nero, who the possible dates would be 64 to 68 AD, or you have Domitian, which is going to be 81 to 96 AD, but his persecution is largely involved toward the end of his reign, and then his persecution, he sends a bunch of people into exile, and then he dies, and then so the Roman Senate reverses his exile and brings people back. So that exile that's being talked about is toward the end of the reign of Domitian. I keep wanting to say the Church of Dormition for whatever reason. So if I confuse the statement there, have mercy upon my soul. So when you relate this evidence together, when you put it together, it seems like Hegesippus would be a testimony in early church history that John was exiled during the time of Domitian. I mean, that seems to be clear. If it wasn't him, it would at least be some other, there seems to be some other written source. Now, everyone appeals to Irenaeus, and Irenaeus is cited in this section, but he's not cited in the broader section. Remember, Hegesippus is cited multiple times in this section. There's just one quote that's given to Irenaeus as a sub-point to support this idea of Domitian. And Eusebius isn't shy about citing Irenaeus. So if Irenaeus was the main source for this, you would think that he would be cited. But instead, it talks about some sort of well-known tradition which is supported by these authors. So again, this isn't a slam dunk argument because Eusebius doesn't specifically attribute this information to Hegesippus, but contextually, it's more likely than anybody else that's mentioned in the context that Hegesippus would be the source for this information, that he would be the source for John's exile to Patmos, as we see in Revelation 1:9. That's where John claims he is when he has this revelation from the Isle of Patmos. So Hegesippus is likely the source for that. Minimally, though, we could say that there seems to be a well-established tradition at that point. So let's talk more about Irenaeus, though, because Irenaeus is the big one. He's roughly around at the same time as Hegesippus. He lives from about 120 to 202 AD. And the thing about Irenaeus, he has such an interesting history, and he's one of the poster children for premillennialism, because it's very, very clear that he was a premillennialist. And it's one of those things where when you study church history, it's obvious that the early church was premillennial. In fact, Eusebius, as a church historian, was actually amillennial, but he says very clearly that the early church was largely Chiliasts. They were premillennialists. So when you trace church history, it's kind of interesting how that works out. But one of the interesting things about Irenaeus is that he claimed to be a disciple, and it's largely reported that he was a disciple of Polycarp. Now, Polycarp, who was the bishop of Smyrna, was a student of the Apostle John. So Polycarp was somebody who sat at the Apostle John's feet, conversed with him and with other individuals who saw the Lord. So it's just a twice removed individual from the Lord. Now, this is from a letter from Irenaeus to an individual named Florinus, and he says this: "For while I was still a boy, I knew you in Lower Asia, in Polycarp's house, when you were a young man of rank in the royal hall, and endeavored to stand well with him. I remember the events of those days more clearly than those which happened recently, for what we learn as children grows up with the soul and is united to it, so that I can speak even of the place in which the blessed Polycarp sat and disputed, how he came in and went out, the character of his life, the appearance of his body, the discourses which he made to the people, how he reported his intercourse with John and with the others who had seen the Lord, how he remembered their words and what were the things concerning the Lord which he had heard from them, and about their miracles and about their teaching, and how Polycarp had received from the eyewitnesses of the word of life and reported all things in agreement with scriptures." So what he's claiming there, as is being quoted by Eusebius, is the fact that, hey, I sat up with you, I sat at Polycarp's feet with you, we learned from him who learned from John. And that's just a really neat thing to think about, is that we have some writings from somebody who studied from the individual who studied from John. I just think that that's really neat as we trace that. So Irenaeus hypothetically would know quite well the provenance of Revelation. And that's one of the things that makes him such a valuable witness, is if he knows the individual who spent a lot of time with the Apostle John, you would think that he wouldn't get the dating of Revelation wrong. But that's one of the things that you have to say, is either Irenaeus is wrong on his dating of Revelation, or it's misunderstood. So Irenaeus has a very famous statement about the dating of Revelation. I'm going to read it here, and then we're going to talk about it. So he says this, and basically this is from, well, the thing about Irenaeus is there are no extant Greek copies of his work. So his Latin is preserved, but Eusebius records in the Greek his work. So we do have some of Irenaeus in Greek thanks to Eusebius, but we have Latin for Irenaeus's main works. So this is in the Greek, though, as it's recorded in Eusebius in Book 3, Chapter 18, and then the third verse of that section. So it says this: "But if it had been necessary to announce his name plainly at the present time, it would have been spoken by him who saw the apocalypse. For it was not seen long ago, but almost in our own time, at the end of the reign of Domitian." So again, I'm gonna read that again. Not when it says by him who saw the apocalypse, that's clearly a reference to John. Nobody debates that. But then the next phrase, "for it was not seen long ago, almost in our own time, at the end of the reign of Domitian." Well, remember, Domitian reigns from 81 to 96 AD. So if this is true, if it stands as it is, then 100% this is a slam dunk for the late date of Revelation. There's just no way around it. So there is one other possible translation you could have of this, though. You could translate it, instead of "for it was not seen," i.e. the Revelation or the apocalypse, but he was not seen. In other words, John was not seen at the end of the, or sorry, John was not seen long ago, but almost in our own time at the end of the reign of Domitian. Now, that is what we would call a grammatical possibility, but it is very, 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 very unlikely. And so there's a couple things that we need to think about with regard to this. So basically, Gentry and other preterists have to get around this statement. And so the two options would be either to interpret it or to call it out as being falsified. So today we're only going to have time to talk really about the reinterpretation, but if necessary, we can go into the falsification of it or the attempted falsification of it. But I think that the majority individuals would probably try to reinterpret it, but I don't really know. It seems very, very easy to understand from my perspective, but we're going to go into some of the objections to this statement. So first of all, individuals can bring up the context of saying, well, it's John who's the main focus here. But really, if you look at what's going on here, you have the apocalypse or the title of Revelation being the main target. In fact, if you look at Irenaeus in his Latin works, remember, this is just one quote from Eusebius of a broader work. So if you look at Irenaeus, the entire chapter in 530 in his work Against Heresies, he has an entire chapter devoted to talking about the future Antichrist as found in Revelation 13. That's another subject for another time, but I think it's helpful to understand Irenaeus was a futurist. He obviously would not be a preterist. He was arguing for a future Antichrist. And so when you look at his chapter in its original work, he's talking, the primary subject is the apocalypse itself and how that is an interpretation. So looking at the context in Irenaeus, the main subject is most likely of the verb, the revelation itself, not actually the individual John. In addition, when you look at how the verb of seeing or appearing, it's translated appearing, but it's the verb harao, to see in Greek. So if you look at how the verb of seeing in Revelation is used, it's typically, it is, the idea of revelation lends itself to sight. And so you have the Chi-Adon formula that's really famous in discussions about revelation and the formulas and structure of revelation. Basically, it's always translated, and then I saw, then I saw, then I saw. And the point is that John is seeing so much. And so in Irenaeus' statement, it's way more likely that Irenaeus is saying it was seen, because that's literally what John said. I think it's something over 60 times in the book of Revelation. John says, then I saw, and it appeared to me, etc. And so it's way more likely, given the context of discussion of Revelation, that he's going to say that the book of Revelation, the actual apocalypse, the vision was seen instead of John was seen. It's just very unlikely that you would describe an individual. You would describe the longevity of an individual by saying he was seen. That's not very. Maybe he lived, or he was around. We obviously we're dealing with a Greek language problem, not English, so the same idioms don't apply. But if you look through even the New Testament, how the appearing shows up, it's not usually. In fact, I can't think of any examples of where it's used in longevity examples. So, and in any case, don't want to belabor that point. It's just doesn't seem to be as likely that that's how it would be brought out. Another argument that's brought up is this idea of timing. So because of the phrase seen not long ago, a lot of people take that phrase and say, okay, how could Irenaeus, who is writing about 180 AD, how could he say this was not seen long ago at the end of the reign of Domitian, when that's 85 years after its composition? So if Revelation's written around 95 AD and Irenaeus is writing at 180, how can he say it was not seen, or it was seen not long ago? Because that doesn't seem like not long ago. I mean, whenever I use that phrase, I mean, I understand the argument. When I use that phrase, I'm not thinking 85 years. If I say, oh, it wasn't that long ago, it was only 85 years, okay, well, I understand. But the problem with that argument is it doesn't really solve anything, because even if John is the subject of the verb, you still run into the same problem. How is it more helpful if you have Irenaeus being writing about John and John is existing at the same time? The argument solves nothing, because you have the same problem with dating, if it's really a problem. I don't think it is. But if it is a problem, whether it's John or the writing of Revelation, it would still be the same timing, because he's dating it to Domitian. That's very clear. So this argument doesn't really do anything for me. I have a hard time understanding it sometimes. And the whole point is that if Irenaeus was born at 120 AD, that's only 25 years from the writing of Revelation. And so that's pretty close. I mean, when I think about my life, I think 25 years isn't that long. And so I don't think that this objection is very strong at all, but it's worth noting as well. Now, the other thing that people will bring up is that Irenaeus makes some statements about Revelation that are incompatible with this statement. So, for example, one of the things that Gentry points out is Eusebius's quote of Irenaeus, and it says this. The quote, by the way, is from Ecclesiastical History in Book 5, Chapter 8, Verse 5. It says this: "These things were said by the writer referred to in the third book of this treatise, which has been quoted before. And the fifth book he discourses thus about the apocalypse of John and the number of the Antichrist." And this is the quote by Irenaeus now. "Now, since this is so, and since this number is found in all the good and ancient copies, since those who have seen John's face can testify." Now, Gentry says, isn't this remarkable? This is a quote from his work. "Isn't this remarkable that in the same breath, Irenaeus can mention those who have seen John face to face and all the good and ancient copies of Revelation?" So his point here, I stopped the quote actually. He would say, "It would seem that the ancient character of the copies would suggest something more ancient than the end of Domitian's reign, which Irenaeus spoke of almost in our own generation." So his conclusion, basically, Gentry's, that is that he's talking about seeing John face to face in the non-ancient sense, but the copies of Revelation, which are ancient. So in other words, they're in his mind, in his interpretation, there would be a difference between the life of John and the ancient copies of Revelation. Now, I would press back a little bit on this. I think that it's pushing a little much. If Revelation is written in 65 AD, does that make it ancient? Because basically that's 30 more years. I don't think that would qualify in any sense of the term as ancient. I think obviously we're talking about the equivalent of Scripture. I'm not convinced that you could somehow argue that the existence of 30 years would somehow drive a very sharp distinction between these terms. I mean, I understand the argument, but I think that that's putting a little too much on that statement. So even though that's one of the arguments that's raised, I think that there are other reasons to support just keeping Irenaeus' statement straightforward, understandable, and I'm just going to give you these, and then we're going to be done. And again, I'm going to rely on Hitchcock here and his dissertation. I think he does a really good job collating these things together. So the first thing, just to start off, would be that this statement by Irenaeus that's quoted in Eusebius and then verified in the Latin translation has no reputable English translation using John as the subject of the verb. It's always the revelation or the apocalypse as the subject. That's the most natural way to take it, and the reputable English translations translate it that way. Now, that's the first thing. Second thing, when you think about how grammar works, and in this case, English and Greek work very similarly, the nearest antecedent is usually the subject of the verb. And in this case, the antecedent right before the verb is the apocalypse, is the revelation. And so that's most naturally the verb picked up whenever a subject is not mentioned. You normally just pick up the nearest antecedent. Now, there are exceptions to that, but it's very rare, and there needs to be some sort of reason. And we already saw that the overall context would support the emphasis on revelation. Plus, I think we need to be forthright about the fact that it's really rare to talk about a person appearing in that sense, in that context. It's just not natural. So third thing is that the Latin translation puts the emphasis on the revelation as well. So in Latin, because, well, Latin, like Greek, has the masculine, feminine, and neuter capabilities. In English, we don't have gendered inflection in our words, but the Greek translator of this text uses a neuter pronoun or a neuter to communicate the fact that this word is referring to revelation, not referring to, say, a masculine individual like John, right? So the Latin, a very clear early testimony to how this section should be understood, viewed it clearly as a reference to the revelation. Now, I already mentioned this, but it's worth repeating, is that with the context of Revelation, it's a seeing book. John is seeing this, seeing this, seeing this. It makes sense that it would be referred to as having been seen, because that is what the revelation is. It's what was appeared as a vision to John. And so that reference would be very clear, and it would make so much sense. I mean, that's just the most natural way to take it. No two ways about it. So that's something that should be mentioned as well. Fifth, we need to remember that if we're supposed to take John as the intended subject, it would be very inconsistent of Irenaeus to only mention the reign of Domitian. So when we talk about this, the thing that if John is the subject, well, and Irenaeus is making a connection here. If Irenaeus is trying to bring the matter as close to his own time as possible, he would have likely talked about Trajan, who is the emperor between 98 and 117 AD, because John lived to that time. And that's something we can verifiably prove that Irenaeus knew, because in his works, if we consult his Against Heresies work in Book 2, Chapter 22, verse 5, or Book 3, Chapter 3, verse 4, you can see that he was very aware of John living to that time. In fact, I'm just going to mention one here. This is the 2:22:5, and he's talking about Jesus' ministry and whatever, and how individuals had conversations, and he says those who were conversant in Asia with John, the disciple of the Lord, affirming that John conveyed to them that information, and he remained among them up to the times of Trajan. So when you say this, here you have Irenaeus confirming that you had John testifying to individuals in Asia after his exile from Patmos, and he remained there up till the times of Trajan. So church history is very clear that John lived to the age of 100, and he experienced a lot. And he actually, after the book of Revelation was given, he went to Asia. And when you think about this, Irenaeus knows this fact. So if he was trying to just mention the fact that John appeared to us even up to the time of Domitian, why would he say it that way? Why wouldn't he say, oh, John was so close to us, he lived up to the time of Trajan? I mean, he knew that. He said that in his other works. So if John was the subject of that, it's more likely that he would have mentioned Trajan instead of Domitian. I don't see. Now, I think that if I can remember correctly, the counter argument would be that Irenaeus forgot, or that he was just inconsistent on that. But I think it's problematic to assume. Now, granted, there are definitely imperfections in historians, and we understand that. But that's problematic to assume for the sake of argument that somebody is going to be inconsistent. I mean, that's part of basics of argumentation, is that you're trying to assume somebody's consistent. That's how we play this game of argumentation. So logically, that is a fairly strong argument. And then just in summary too, the statement that's worth being said here is that you have, throughout the next generations of church history, after Irenaeus, you have essentially a unanimous, we can talk more about this in the future, but you have essentially a unanimous history of the church believing that Revelation was written during the time of Dormition, and during the 95-96 time period. And as part of that, you have these individuals coming after Irenaeus who repeat that. Now, if this passage was grammatically ambiguous, why is it that there's no other translations of this or no other viewpoints of this passage or this understanding? If Revelation was handed down at 65 to 67, 64 to 68 AD, even anywhere in there, why is it that there's no evidence of that? Why is it that this statement by Eusebius was not reinterpreted by any of the other individuals? His Latin translation is also on par with understanding the Revelation as being the main subject. It seems to be very, very clear that the external church evidence here points to a late date of Revelation during the time of Domitian. Now, we belabor this point. We speak heartily to it. And one of the things that I want to really emphasize here is that you can't really reinterpret Irenaeus. What you have to do is you have to attack his character or his credibility as a witness, because I don't think there's a verifiable way that his statements can be interpreted. It's just too clear from the evidence. So I want to put forward there, and I would back up from that and say there's not really a reason to try to falsify his witness either. And this is where I would challenge the preterism camp with regard to Revelation. Now, granted, they're going to do a lot of argumentation from the internal witness of Revelation, okay? And I understand that, and I think that there's obviously other ways to understand Revelation, which make more sense, but we'll talk about that in the future at some point. Oh, that's kind of a play on words there, in the future. I should give myself a pat on the back for that one, but I won't. And one of the things that we need to understand, though, is that if your system of interpretation causes you to try to bend some very, very clear external evidence. Let's put it this way. This external testimony by the church is so strong that it's very, very difficult to find ways around it. And so if we're trying to find ways around to redate the book of Revelation, it seems suspect. Our whole system needs to be examined then, if we're trying so hard to go against some of the things that have been recognized for church history for a long time, and these individuals who are talking. Think about Irenaeus. He's a twice removed individual from the Apostle John, and so these things are important for us to consider. And I would just put forward this, is that I think the external evidence is so strong for dating Revelation later. And I would say also the internal evidence is not as strong as people want to say for preterism, but that will have to be another episode at some other point. I have some other episode ideas, so I'm not sure when we'll get to that, but I do hope that this has been at least thought-provoking with regard to that. I know that one person individual who shall remain nameless told me my last episode put them to sleep on preterism, so I do want to be cognizant of making entertaining material. So I don't want to bore people to death. But like I said, I want to just make this available to people and hope it's helpful. So if it is, or if it's not, I feel free to contact me. You can access the contact form on my website, peteryeaman.com. You can also access the blog articles and various assortments of resources that I have there. If you want more information on Shepherd's Theological Seminary and the upcoming fall semester, if you want to register, you can visit shepherds.edu. Until next time, may the Lord bless you and keep you. and make his face shine upon you. Happy 4th of July, everybody.